Hi guys, it's Sav here, and today I'm going to be talking about my TBR list for June, which is Pride History Month. This June I have a lot to be proud of, actually. I'm really proud to be queer, I'm proud to be a member of the queer community, and I'm proud to be a bookseller here at Changing Hands. So let's talk about some gay books. Just like I did for my last video, I separated some of these books here by genre, so if you know you like something, whether it's like fiction or memoir or an advice book or something, you can go ahead and click through this video and find the books that's right for you. But let's jump into some fiction to get started. All right, folks, first up we have With Teeth, which is an Own Voices book by Lambda Award finalist Kristen, Arnett. Now, we know how much I love domestic novels and how much I love domestic novels with queer people at the center, and this is the book that I'm really excited to jump into. This is a story about Sammy Lucas, who is a queer woman living in Central Florida, raising her son with her wife, but unfortunately, motherhood doesn't come so easily for her as it does, especially not as easily as it comes to her wife. It's also made difficult because her son, Tamsyn, isn't actually the easiest kid to parent. He's kind of sullen, and he's really unreadable. And over the course of the book, we watch as he grows older from a toddler to a sort of surly teenager. And as he gets older, Sammy actually gets worse at mothering somehow. And we see as her life kind of starts to deteriorate, unfortunately, and her behavior and her son's behavior both become more unruly as time goes on. I hear that it's incredibly cringeworthy, and what I love about that is the fact that queer parenting is just as messy as parenting with heterosexual couples. You know, you never really know how to do right by your kid. There's this added pressure of getting it right the first time around, and having this picturesque lifestyle so that other people, especially people that don't support you in your life, can see that you're normal. But unfortunately, sometimes things aren't normal. They don't go according to plan. So I like to read books where people's lives fall apart. Sometimes it makes me feel a little better about myself. So I'm excited to jump into this one and see just how Sammy handles the fact that maybe she's not a good mother after all, and maybe that's okay. I don't know. We'll see how it ends. So I've had my eye on this next novel for about a year now because it was released in the UK about a year ago to huge acclaim, and I'm really excited that it's now finally going to be made available to American audiences. This book is Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez. This is a story that spans multiple generations, and it starts in the 1950s with Jamaican ex-boxer Norman Alonzo as he immigrates to Britain to try to find a better life for his family, a very common immigrant story. It's a story where he kind of experiences some overt racism as he exists in another culture now. He's totally ostracized. As the head of his household, he's trying to provide for his family, and he's trying to figure out a way to navigate the nuances of this new culture. It then jumps ahead to the turn of the millennium to his grandson, 19-year-old Jesse, who is a young kid who's escaping actually religious oppression as a Jehovah's Witness, and he moves to London to try to make a new life for himself, not unlike his grandfather in the 50s. Eventually turns to music, art, and sex work to find survival, to be able to survive in this society, literally and spiritually. So this is a really interesting story about the ways that we craft our own narratives for ourselves that are built upon past legacies, as well as new notions of what we want to create for our own lives. And in this story, Jesse starts to form his new notions of masculinity and spirituality and what it means to be a queer person, and who's also facing issues of class, poverty, and race. It's a super intersectional story, and I love that this is a story that, even though it's set in Britain, it still can definitely be applied here in America, and there's lots to be learned from stories like these. I'm really excited to talk about this next book. This book was released at the very beginning of this month, and it's one of the hugest releases for Pride Month because it's written by Casey McQuiston. That is One Last Stop. Now, the reason I love Casey McQuiston is she's practically queer romance royalty now after the huge success of her last novel, Red, White, and Royal Blue. This is, instead of a story about two men, this is actually a story about two women this time. And Casey has really just gone all in on this. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, obviously. That's why it's on my TBR list. I cracked it open last night. I haven't gotten very far, but I'm so excited to jump in. The fun thing about this story is actually it's a time travel story. What? So, okay, you take a queer romance and then you give it this time travel element. That's amazing. I love time travel romances, probably because they're so like angsty. You know, on one hand, you could be with your soulmate who you love very dearly, love that's so strong enough that it bends time. But on the other hand, in choosing to be with them, you might be like, you know, ruining the space-time continuum, etc., etc. I don't know, maybe I would ruin the space-time continuum for the right person. Who knows? It's Pride Month, anything can happen. So it's everything that you want out of a romance novel. And with the fact that you have two different queer heroines that come from two different generations, you can kind of look at various histories and the ways that the queer experience has changed over time and how two people who come from different experiences might relate to each other and even fall in love. All right, let's jump into some science fiction, one of my absolute favorite genres. To kick us off, I have one of my favorite sci-fi series that I have read in the last couple of years. And if you've come into the store and you've asked me for a sci-fi pick, or maybe if you're like one of my friends or my unlucky coworkers who have heard me talk ad nauseum about this story, then you're probably already familiar with the Locked Tomb Trilogy by Tamsyn Muir. Unfortunately, the third book isn't out yet. It's set to come out in sometime next year, and I am anxiously awaiting for it to come out. But these first two books are here, and they are fantastic. First up in the series, you have Gideon the Ninth. Now let me just tell you what the tagline is of this story, and maybe that'll sell you. Lesbian necromancers explore a haunted Gothic palace in space. So I don't even know what else you need as far as book recommendations go, but this book is amazing. What I love about this story is that it's got such a unique magic system. It's a sci-fi sort of fantasy mix, and if you are a sci-fi fan who really likes complex world building, roller coaster ride kind of stories where they just throw you in and they don't explain anything because, you know, you're smart enough to keep up, then this is the kind of story that you'll like to read. Especially since this is super meme-worthy, it's laugh out loud funny. Another cool thing about it is that it actually has a really diverse and popping online fandom. So if you're the kind of person who likes to jump into the online experience, you can experience it right now as it's happening before the third book comes out. And trust me, you won't regret it. It's a riot and a half. It's awesome. So this next pick, I'm really excited to jump into. It's Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. This is a story that actually one of my good friends, Savannah, another bookseller in Changing Hands, she works in Changing Hands Phoenix, but not me, a different Savannah. She actually read this book and she gave me the perfect review for it. Rivers Solomon's haunting new novel lives in the liminal spaces to which the others of white America are relegated. It's about the burden of existence, the burden of the body, the burden of motherhood, the burden of love, and the unbearable shared burden of racial trauma. It's about the gifts of these as well, the joy to be found in all that you've been told to be ashamed of because you don't exist in the right way. Vern is a heroine of contradictions, a force of nature beyond the narrow confines of binary systems of gender, sexuality, or race. And like her, Sorrowland is not any one thing. It's Southern Gothic, it's coming of age, it's thriller, it's sci-fi, it's magical realism, romance, and mystery, and it can only be truly called at every moment entirely unexpected. I'm really excited to jump into this story because I love sci-fi that explores race and sexuality in sort of alternate realities. We get a lot of books about, our own reality, things that exist now, but sometimes I feel like this sort of disassociation from our society helps us provide reference to what actually is happening in our society. And this story is really exciting because it's unlike our own reality in so many ways, and yet really reflects back a lot of our issues. And as always, intersectional tales of gender, sexuality, race are always incredibly illuminating on all of those things as we explore the multifaceted ways that one person can be queer. Reader, let me ask you a question. Are you a fan of The Great Gatsby Or maybe if you're not a fan of it, were you forced to read it in high school and maybe liked it a little bit? Well, I have a version of The Great Gatsby that's even better than the original. Now, I know that's saying a lot because, Fitzgerald, but also Fitzgerald. Who wants Fitzgerald when you can have The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nghi. This is a really awesome retelling of The Great Gatsby from Jordan Baker's perspective. Remember Jordan Baker? She's kind of a minor-ish character in that novel, but because The Great Gatsby just recently came into the public domain, we can now do whatever we want with it, which actually means that we could talk about Jordan Baker and sort of explore her more as a character. And in this version, she's actually queer and Asian. She's a Vietnamese adoptee who lives in the 1920s jazz age. And to make it even cooler, this version of The Great Gatsby actually has magic. That's what puts it in our sci-fi and fantasy section. I'm so excited to read this book specifically because, just like many people, I read The Great Gatsby as a kid and I really liked it, but I, to be honest, wish that it had explored more of its very frank homoerotic undertones. Well, this book explores that and more, and illuminating, again, Jordan Baker, who's now a multifaceted person who is exploring her identity in an age where not only is alcohol prohibited, but so is demon blood. So that's pretty cool. I think it's a great response to the original, while also it's really dazzling and really builds up off the original and makes it something even better. Not only is June Pride Month, but it also has a major holiday. That's Father's Day. And one of my picks for Pride Month and for Father's Day, Non-Traditional Families, is The Natural Mother of the Child by Krys Belc. This is a story written by Krys, who is a trans masculine person. It's a story about how when he gave birth to his child with his partner, he was listed actually as the natural mother of the child. How that started this whole complicated inner journey within him, where he explored what motherhood means, what fatherhood means, what it means to be a trans person as you're navigating all of these things, as you're a role model to a child, as you're trying to break free from old gender norms, old gender binaries, and creating a new normal for your family. But what does that mean when everyone around you views you as the natural mother of the child? I think that this story really talks about these concepts of parenthood in a way that's really accessible. It's a highly visual story. It's filled with photographs, documents, and illustrations that help enhance the story. And when Krys was talking about why he chose to put so much visual stimuli within the narrative, he talked about how he wanted the reader to experience what microaggressions and what these small reactions to even good things or interesting images, how they would play with the reader and how the reader could have an experience that was more similar to a trans person. So this is not only a memoir, it's a memoir in essays, it's a memoir in it's a multimedia memoir as it comes to the documents and the photos and so on. And it's a sort of multifaceted experience that you as the reader can go on that may bring you closer to this trans person and their family, to even the concepts that are within this story of motherhood, fatherhood. And I think that this is a must read for any person who is struggling with how to define their own parenthood, how to define their own gender, how to define their own familial units. And I think that this is a great pick for Father's Day. This next memoir is Fairest by Meredith Talusan, out in paperback this month. Fairest is a story of Meredith, who actually grew up as a boy in the Philippines, a boy who has albinism, otherwise known as a sun child in the Philippines. And this is a story about how that little boy grew up to become a woman in America. It's an immigrant story, it's a story of diaspora, and it's a story of finding your own legacy within your family, the desirability of wanting to find place and a common place within your own community, within distant communities, and what it means to be wanted in a community, to be wanted by your partner. This is a story that, as the title references, brings up concepts of fairness. I know as myself, as a queer person, I have constantly asked myself whether or not it's fair to have some of the experiences that I have. Meredith discusses this concept of fairness in this memoir, Not only fairest as in like beauty and desirability, but fairest as in what is fairest for us all. And I think that this immigrant story told by a trans person who has albinism is a really interesting intersection that can explore that very specific concept. All right, let's jump into some books that are more along the line of advice books. I know that I definitely need a lot of advice in my life, and what better way to start than a book that makes me laugh out loud every time I look at it, which is The Ex-Girlfriend of My Ex-Girlfriend is My Girlfriend, advice on queer dating, love, and friendship by Maddy and illustrated by Kelsey Wroten. This is a book of advice with actual questions that were submitted to Maddy when she originally published this as a zine. This is a 3-part zine, and I think the titles are hilarious. The first one was The Ex-Girlfriend of My Ex-Girlfriend is My Girlfriend, as listed here, and Volume 2 was The Ex-Girlfriend of My Ex-Girlfriend is My Wife, and of course, naturally, Volume 3 is The Ex-Girlfriend of My Ex-Girlfriend is My Ex-Wife, and it really is like that sometimes when it comes to queer dating, and I think that there's so much nuance and confusion. Having a book like this with, again, real questions that were submitted that's so beautifully illustrated, it's so non-judgmental, and it talks about all of the different ways that that queerness and queer dating and queer love can manifest. Not only can it be confusing when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to gender, when it comes to the gender binary, it can just be confusing in general, dating around. And this book isn't written by a therapist, as it says right here on the back. Maddy is not a therapist, she's just a lesbian who loves boundaries. And I can definitely get behind that. So I think you should pick up this book, whether or not you are new or old to the queer dating scene, to queer love, queer friendship, any of it. This book has something for everybody. Next up, we have another book that comes out on June 8th of this year, and that is Hola Poppy by John Paul Brammer. You might be familiar with John Paul, JP, as he is known online, from his huge Twitter following. He's a really prominent sort of like humorist, leftist on there, and he's constantly posting these meme-worthy tweets. But other than his meme-worthy tweets, he also has this advice column called Hola Poppy, where he caters his advice towards a queer audience, and specifically queer Latinx people. Though his advice doesn't just go towards queer Latinx people or specifically gay men, it also is for everybody. This is so funny, and it's the kind of book that you just have to keep reading because it's teaching you things, it's making you laugh, it feels incredibly relevant nowadays. And I think that, again, just like with the last book I talked about, it's advice for people that otherwise might not find many resources or advice for where they're at in their lives, their situation they're in the community that they're in. And JP really brings his A game to this when he published this book. Next up, we have a sort of collection. This is a collection of photographs by Jamal Jordan, Photographs and Stories. This is called Queer Love in Color. And this is a collection specifically about queer couples of color and their stories, little anecdotes about their lives, where they live, their experiences together as a couple. Let me just say this book is gorgeous. Not the kind of like photograph book that you want to put on your coffee table. This is something you really want to sit with as you look at these gorgeous photos of these queer couples. This kind of accessibility, this kind of representation is so important. As we know, queer people of color face exceptionally more violence than white queer people, and having this kind of positive representation showing the beauty, the absolute sublimeness of queer love, I think is so important to showing all of our community, not just a certain part of it. Last but certainly not least, we have a graphic piece of nonfiction by Cyan Rose. That is Our Work is Everywhere, an illustrated oral history of queer and trans resistance. This book is an amalgamation of interviews that Cyan actually did with various people in the queer community. She not only conducted the interviews, but she also drew these beautiful sort of surrealist illustrations that accompany the information and the high concepts that some of these queer people talk about. It's incredibly diverse. It spans so many different factions of the community, so many various experiences within the queer community, and again, bringing to light some of these marginalized folks who are not necessarily represented very often. I really wanted to end on these last two books because I think it's really important to honor ourselves as a community, to honor again, where we've come from, where we're headed, but especially where we're at now. Thank you guys so much for hearing me rave about some of these books I'm most excited to read this month, this Pride Month. There's so much to be excited about. And remember that you can order and pre-order any of these books in store or online at changinghands.com. And if you like content like this, make sure to subscribe and like and sound off in the comments. Let me know if there's any book that you think that I missed this Pride Month.